The rain fell mercilessly over New York City on that June night. Sarah huddled under the awning of an abandoned building in the city center, protecting her newborn baby in her arms. The raindrops mixed with the tears that ran down her face, marked by fatigue and pain. Just a few hours ago, she had given birth alone, relying only on her strength and determination. As she looked at the small bundle in her arms, her mind wandered to the events that had brought her here. Less than a year ago, she had everything: a promising career as a lawyer, a comfortable home, and what she believed to be a happy marriage. Until Richard, her ex-husband, revealed his true nature. In an elaborate fraud, he managed to transfer all of the couple's savings to an offshore account, leaving Sarah completely ruined. How could I have been so naive? She asked herself for the thousandth time while caressing her son's little face. The baby, oblivious to the drama surrounding him, slept peacefully. Sarah looked at her own soaked and dirty clothes, feeling a deep pain as she thought about the future she could offer this innocent child. The sound of a luxury car gliding down the wet street caught her attention. It was a black Mercedes-Benz that seemed out of place in this decaying area of the city. The vehicle passed slowly, as if its occupant was observing something through the tinted windows. To her surprise, the car stopped a few meters ahead. The back door opened, and a tall man wearing an impeccable suit got out, protected by an umbrella held by his driver. He walked towards Sarah with firm and decisive steps. His face had hard features, but there was something in his eyes that conveyed a mixture of interest and compassion. "Good evening," he said with a deep and controlled voice. "My name is Henry Matthews. I'm the president of Matthews Pharmaceutical Industries." Sarah knew that name. Matthews was one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country, often in the headlines for its billion-dollar acquisitions and medical innovations. Henry Matthews was known both for his business genius and his coldness in negotiations. "What do you want?" asked Sarah, instinctively clutching the baby to her chest. Henry adjusted his posture as if he was about to make a business proposal. "Ma'am, I can see you're in a difficult situation. My wife Claire and I cannot have children. We've tried all possible treatments for years without success. I can offer a life of comfort and love for your baby." Sarah felt her heart race. "Are you proposing to buy my child?" "I'm proposing to give a new life to both of you," he replied without hesitation. $5 million, enough to restart your life with dignity, while your son will have access to the best education, health care, and opportunities that money can buy. The baby stirred in Sarah's arms, opening his little eyes. She observed that innocent look, feeling her heart break into 1,000 pieces. How could she consider such a proposal? But how could she deny it, knowing that she couldn't even offer a roof for her son? "And if I accept," she said, her voice trembling, "what are the guarantees that I'll be able to keep in contact with my son?" Henry smiled slightly. "You have my word that you can visit him whenever you wish. We'll say it was a legal adoption, and you can follow his growth. You have my guarantee." Sarah looked at the baby again, then at her soaked clothes, at the dark alley that had become her home. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, as if wanting to wash away her doubts and fears. "I need your answer now," said Henry, his voice mixing with the sound of the rain. "This is a unique opportunity to ensure a better future for everyone." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of that decision crushing her chest. When she opened them again, silent tears ran down her face, mixing with the rainwater that was still falling. She knew that moment would forever change the course of their lives. 6 months had passed since that rainy night. Sarah observed the city through the window of her new apartment in the Upper East Side. The luxurious 3-bedroom property was just one of many changes in her life since she had accepted Henry Matthews's proposal. Her fingers touched the window glass, tracing the outline of the buildings in the distance, while her mind constantly returned to Michael, the name she had given her son before handing him over. The intercom rang, interrupting her thoughts. And it was Sandra, her old college friend and the only person who knew the whole truth about what had happened. "You can't keep torturing yourself like this, Sarah," said Sandra, serving a cup of tea for her friend. "You did what you thought was best for Michael at that moment." "But did I really, Sandra?" Sarah sank into the white leather sofa. "I have money now, yes, I even managed to open my own law firm, but every client I serve, every case I take only makes me think about how I abandoned my own son." "You didn't abandon anyone." Sandra held her friend's hand firmly. "You ensured a better life for him, and Henry promised you could see him whenever you wanted, didn't he?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "Promises. It's been 3 months since I've been trying to schedule a visit. There's always an excuse. Claire is traveling with the baby, Michael is sick, it's not a good time." I'm starting to think I was naive to believe his words. At the same moment, on the other side of the city, in the Matthews mansion in the Hamptons, Claire was cradling Michael in her arms, humming an old lullaby. The baby, now 6 months old, smiled as he recognized the voice of the woman he believed to be his mother. Claire hugged him tightly, as if fearing someone might snatch him from her arms. Henry entered the room silently, observing the scene. His face, usually impassive, softened as he saw his wife with the child. "How are my loves doing?" "He's looking more like you every day," Claire replied, adjusting the baby in the crib. "Especially when he smiles. Did you notice the little mark he has on his shoulder, identical to that birthmark of yours?" The comment made Henry freeze for a moment. Yes, he had noticed the similarity, but preferred to ignore it. He approached the crib, observing the little one who was now sleeping peacefully. "Claire, that woman has been calling again. She wants to see Michael." Claire's face changed instantly. "No," she said firmly. "I don't want that woman near our son. We've talked about this, Henry. Michael is ours. The more she gets close, the more confusing it will be for him in the future. We made a deal." "Deal?" Claire turned abruptly to her husband. "You practically bought a baby, Henry. If anyone finds out—" "No, it's better to keep our distance. Besides, she received the money, didn't she? Let her use it to rebuild her life away from us." Henry ran his hand through his graying hair, feeling the weight of his choices. He knew Claire was partly right. The more Sarah got closer, the more complicated the situation could become. But something deeply bothered him. Maybe it was the similarity Claire had mentioned, or maybe it was just his conscience weighing on him. In his mansion's office later that night, Henry was going through old photographs on his laptop. He stopped at an image from 8 months, to show him at a charity event, next to a young brunette who smiled shyly at the camera. His heart raced as he recognized Beatrice, one of the event organizers with whom he had a brief relationship during a crisis in his marriage. Beatrice had mysteriously disappeared soon after, leaving no trace. The phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was his lawyer, Robert Carter. "Mr. Matthews, we have a problem." The voice on the other end sounded tense. "Sarah is threatening to take legal action. She has proof of the agreement you made that night and is willing to go all the way to see the boy." Henry felt a drop of cold sweat run down his forehead. His empire, built over decades, could crumble, if that story came to light. But there was something else, something he couldn't even explain, a disturbing feeling that there was much more to this story than he imagined. Sarah walked through the corridors of the New York County Courthouse with determined steps. After months of frustrated attempts to see Michael, she had finally decided to act. In her hands, she carried a folder with carefully organized documents, bank records of the $1 million transfer, recordings of conversations with Henry, and the informal agreement they had made on that rainy night. "Miss Sarah," a familiar voice called her. It was Lucy, an old colleague from when she interned at the courthouse. "It's been so long. I heard you opened your own law firm." "Yes, things have changed quite a bit," Sarah replied, trying to maintain a cordial smile. "Actually, I need your help. Do you still work in the records office?" Lucy nodded, curious. "For 10 years, why?" "I need information about a birth certificate," Sarah lowered her voice, "of a child registered about 6 months ago by the Matthews. Henry and Claire Matthews." Lucy's face turned serious. "Sarah, you know I can't—" "Please, Lucy," Sarah interrupted. "It's important. Vital. I promise no one will know you helped me." After a few moments of hesitation, Lucy agreed. "Come back. Tomorrow. I'll see what I can do." Meanwhile, at the headquarters of Matthews Pharmaceutical Industries, Henry was participating in a tense meeting with Robert Carter, his lawyer, on the top floor of the imposing building. "She won't give up, Henry," Robert warned, adjusting. his thin-rimmed glasses. And if she decides to make this public? Can you imagine the headlines? Billionaire buys baby from homeless woman. Your stocks would plummet in minutes. Henry stood up, walking to the window that offered a panoramic view of the city. How much? What? How much do we need to offer for her to disappear for good? Robert shook his head. It's not that simple. She doesn't seem to be interested in more money. She wants the boy. Henry felt a tightness in his chest as he thought of Michael. Over the past few months he had developed a deep love for the boy. Each smile, each small achievement of the baby filled him with pride. And that birthmark. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Robert, he hesitated for a moment. I need you to investigate someone. Beatrice Oliver. She worked in the organization of that charity event last year, remember? The lawyer frowned. The brunette who disappeared? Why? Just do it, discreetly. That same afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected call at her office. It was a former employee of Matthews, who identified herself only as Rachel. Miss Sarah, I know you're looking for information about the Matthews. The voice on the other end sounded nervous. There are things you need to know, things that happened in the company before the baby appeared. They scheduled a meeting for the next day at a discreet cafe in Greenwich Village. Sarah could barely sleep that night, her mind buzzing with possibilities. At the Matthews mansion, Claire was watching Michael sleep when she noticed something that deeply disturbed her. While changing the baby's clothes, she clearly saw the mark on his shoulder. It wasn't just similar to Henry's, it was identical. Her heart raced. During years of marriage, that mark had been her reference, something unique to her husband. How could a supposedly adopted child have exactly the same mark? Claire began to search her husband's office that same night, after he left for an emergency meeting. Among old documents, she found a yellowed envelope with photos. Her blood froze as she saw one in particular, Henry next to a young brunette at a charity event. The date on the back of the photo was exactly 9 months before Michael's birth. Litae. Next morning, Sarah arrived early at the cafe for her meeting with Rachel. While waiting, she leafed through the documents that Lucy had managed to get about Michael's registration. Something caught her attention. The dates didn't match. According to the record, Michael had been born in a private hospital 3 days before she had found him. How could that be possible? Her cell phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. Don't trust anyone. Beatrice Oliver is the key to everything. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Who was Beatrice Oliver? And why did that name seem to carry so much weight? Before she could process these questions, she saw a woman hurriedly enter the cafe, nervously looking around. It was Rachel, and her face showed that she carried secrets too heavy to keep alone. Rachel sat down at the cafe table, her hands trembling slightly as she held her coffee cup. Sarah carefully observed the woman in front of her. She appeared to be about 50, well-groomed grey hair and eyes that carried the weight of secrets kept for too long. I worked as Mr. Matthews's executive secretary for 15 years, Rachel began, her voice low and controlled. I saw a lot happen in that company, things I preferred to pretend I didn't see to keep my job. But this is different. This what? Asked Sarah, leaning forward. Beatrice Oliver, Rachel pronounced, the name as if it were a confession. She was different from the others. Mr. Matthews really got involved with her. She was a beautiful, intelligent girl, worked in organizing charity events. They had an affair for 3 months while Mrs. Clare was in Europe undergoing treatment. Sarah felt her heart race. And what happened to her? She simply disappeared. One day Beatrice came to the office, very nervous, wanting to talk to Mr. Matthews. She was pregnant. Rachel paused, taking a sip of coffee. He received her in his office. The discussion was intense. After that day, I never saw her again. Sarah took the photo of Michael's birth certificate out of her bag. How long ago was this? 9 months before the baby appeared, Rachel replied, her eyes widening as she saw the date on the document. On the other side of town, Claire Matthews was sitting in her closet, surrounded by dozens of old papers and photographs. Her hands trembled as she held an envelope she had just found hidden in a jewelry box. Inside, a positive pregnancy test and a handwritten note. "Henry, we need to talk. I can't hide this forever. Beatrice." The sound of heels in the hallway made Claire quickly put everything away. It was Helen, her housekeeper for over 20 years. "Mrs. Claire," Helen hesitated at the door. "The boy is awake." Claire discreetly wiped away a tear. "I'll be right there, Helen. Please prepare his breakfast." "Ma'am," Helen seemed nervous. There's something I need to tell you about the day Michael arrived." Meanwhile, in Robert Carter's office, the lawyer was examining a series of documents about Beatrice Oliver. Her disappearance coincided exactly with a large bank transfer made by one of Henry's offshore companies. Robert had always been loyal to money, but this story was starting to make him uneasy. His phone rang. It was a private investigator he had hired. "Mr. Carter, I found something interesting," said the voice on the other end. Beatrice Oliver had a prenatal consultation at a private clinic in Greenwich, exactly 8 months before the boy's birth. And guess what? The clinic belongs to one of the minority shareholders of Matthews Industries. Sarah, after her meeting with Rachel, headed to the former headquarters of the charity organization where Beatrice worked. The building was almost empty, but an old cleaning lady still remembered her. "Oh, Bee!" exclaimed the lady. "Such a beautiful and dedicated girl. She was devastated when she suddenly lost her job. I came to work one morning and her desk was empty. The boss said she had resigned, but her things were all still here. I kept some at home. It didn't seem right to throw them away." Sarah felt her heart race. "Do you still have these things?" In the nursery of the Matthews mansion, Claire was cradling Michael, observing every detail of his little face. Now that she knew what to look for, the similarities to Henry were striking. It wasn't just the birthmark. It was the shape of the eyes, the smile, even some gestures. Helen entered the room carrying a tray with tea. "Mrs. Claire, about what I wanted to tell you. On the night the boy arrived, I saw when Mr. Henry brought him. But before that, much earlier, I saw him talking to a young woman in the garden. She was pregnant. It was that one who worked at the events, Beatrice." Claire felt her legs weaken. She sat in the nursing chair, still holding Michael. "Go on." "Helen." She was desperate, begging him to take responsibility for the child. Said she couldn't raise the baby alone, that she needed his help. Mr. Henry was furious, told her to leave. After that, I never saw her again, until months later the boy appeared, supposedly adopted. Sarah was returning to her apartment with a box of Beatrice's belongings that the cleaning lady had kept. Inside, she found a diary. In the last entry, dated a week before her disappearance, Beatrice had written, "I can't hide it anymore. The baby is his, and he needs to take responsibility. Tomorrow I'll confront him one last time. If he doesn't listen to me, I'll do whatever it takes to protect my child." The sun was setting in New York when Claire Matthews parked her Porsche Cayenne in front of Sarah's building. After days of discreet investigation, she had finally discovered her address. She needed to confront this woman, understand her part in this story that was becoming more complex each day. In her glove compartment, Beatrice's diary, which Helen had found hidden in Henry's office. At the same moment, Sarah was rereading the last pages of Beatrice's other diary, found among her belongings for the 10th time. The words jumped from the page like accusations. "Henry says no one can know about the baby, that it would destroy his marriage, his reputation. He offered money for me to disappear, as if a life could have a price." The intercom rang, startling. "Her." The doorman's voice sounded hesitant. "Miss Sarah, Mrs. Claire Matthews is here, says she needs to speak with you urgently." Sarah felt her stomach churn. She hadn't expected this confrontation so soon, but perhaps it was the opportunity she needed. "You can let her up, Joe." Minutes later, the two women were facing each other in Sarah's living room. Claire, elegant in her Chanel suit, seemed out of place in that simpler though luxurious apartment. "So this is what $50 million can buy," said Claire, her tone between ironic and bitter. "Actually, I invested most of it in my law firm," Sarah replied, maintaining her composure. "But I imagine you didn't come here to discuss my financial choices." Claire took the diary from her purse, placing it on the coffee table. "No, I came to talk about Beatrice Oliveira." The name hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt her heart race but kept her face impassive. "Interesting. I also have something about her," she said, picking up the other diary. The two women studied each other for a long moment, each holding her part of the truth. It was Claire who broke the silence. "Michael is her son with Henry, isn't he?" "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice barely containing the emotion. "And I believe we know what happened to Beatrice." "She didn't disappear voluntarily," Claire completed, her hands trembling slightly. "Henry, he must have done something." "No," Sarah interrupted. "Your husband is many things, but I believe he doesn't even know that Michael is his biological son. The dates, the circumstances, he really thought he was buying the child of a stranger." At that moment, Sarah's phone rang. It was Rachel, Henry's former secretary. "Miss Sarah, I discovered something terrible. Robert Carter, Mr. Matthews' lawyer, he was involved in Beatrice's disappearance. I found old emails, bank transfers. He orchestrated everything without Mr. Matthews' knowledge." Claire watched Sarah's expression change as she listened. To the phone call, when she hung up, her cheeks were pale. "What was it?" "Robert Carter," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "He's behind everything. Beatrice approached him first, threatening to tell Henry everything. Carter, fearing the scandal would affect the business and, consequently, his earnings, took action. He kept her away until the baby was born, and then he staged her disappearance. And somehow you ended up with the baby that night," Claire completed, the pieces fitting together. "He must have planned it all," Sarah continued. "He knew Henry and you wanted a child. He knew I was on the streets after losing everything. It was the perfect plan. Solve the Beatrice problem and still profit from it." The sound of the doorbell interrupted the conversation. It was Sandra, Sarah's friend, with an urgent expression on her face. "Sarah, you need to see this," she said, rushing in and turning on the television. On the news, a report about the discovery of Beatrice's car in a remote region of upstate New York. The three women watched the report in silence. Claire was the first to speak. "We need to tell Henry everything. He has the right to know that Michael is his real son." "It's not that simple," Sarah replied. "Robert Carter won't allow this truth to come to light. He has too much to lose." "Then, let's take him down first," said Claire, her voice taking on a determined tone that surprised even herself. "Together." Sarah looked at Claire, then at Sandra, three different women united by a plot that needed to be unraveled. In the nursery of the Matthews mansion, Michael slept peacefully, unaware that his fate was about to change once again. Sarah's office had been transformed into an impromptu operations center. On the walls, a panel full of documents, photos, and newspaper clippings tried to connect all the dots of the conspiracy. Sandra organized all the found documents with Rachel. Beatrice's story was beginning to fully reveal itself through emails, bank records, and notes. She discovered irregularities in the company's contracts by chance, Rachel explained, showing some files. Carter personally supervised all charity events, used them for money laundering. Beatrice noticed discrepancies in the numbers and started investigating. And when she found out she was pregnant with Henry's child, Sandra completed. Exactly. Carter saw it as a double threat. It wasn't just the president's illegitimate child, it was a woman who knew too much. Helen entered the room carrying a coffee tray. Her eyes were red from crying, but her posture remained dignified. "The police found her body," she said softly, "on a rural property linked to Vincent Torres." Silence weighed in the room. Upstairs, Henry observed the scene from the hallway, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Guilt for not realizing sooner what was happening under his nose. Anger for being manipulated by someone he considered a friend, and a deep pain for Beatrice, for all she suffered alone. "Sir," Helen called gently, "there's something you need to see." She led him to Beatrice's old room in the staff area. The room was exactly as she had left it months ago. On the small desk, a diary and an envelope. She asked me to keep it, Helen explained. Said that one day someone would need to know the truth. Henry opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside there was a letter addressed to him and a series of ultrasound photos of Michael. In the letter, Beatrice explained everything. How she discovered the irregularities, how she tried to protect the company anyway, how her love for Henry made her believe they could find a solution together. She never wanted to cause trouble, Helen said softly. She just wanted her son to grow up knowing who his father was. In Michael's room, Claire and Sarah continued their silent vigil when Henry entered. His face was marked by contained tears. "We need to talk," he said, sitting down next to the two women. "About Michael, about us, about everything." "He deserves to know the truth when he grows up," Sarah said. "About Beatrice, about how he has 3 people who love him unconditionally." Claire took Henry's hand. "We can make this work. Not in the traditional way, maybe, but in our own way." Outside, the day was beginning to dawn in New York. The first news about the scandal was already starting to circulate. The powerful lawyer Robert Carter arrested. Investigations at Matthews Industries. The discovery of Beatrice's body. But inside that room, 3 people were beginning to build something new. A different family, united not by blood or paper, but by love for a little boy who, without knowing, had changed all their lives. 6 months passed since Robert Carter's arrest. The Matthews mansion, once a cold and formal environment, now vibrated with the sound of Michael's laughter, who was completing his first year of life. In the garden, an intimate party gathered only the most important people in his life. Sarah watched her son run clumsily through the grass, closely followed by Claire, who protected him at each uncertain step. The 2 women had developed a friendship that surprised everyone, based on the unconditional love they felt for the boy. "I still wonder how we managed to get here," Sandra said, approaching with 2 glasses of champagne. She handed one to Sarah. "Sometimes I wonder too," Sarah replied, smiling as she watched Michael trying to reach a balloon. "But then I look at him and know it was all worth it." On the other side of the garden, Henry was talking to Helen, who after years of discreet service was now treated as part of the family. The housekeeper had become a key figure in the new dynamics of the house, being the guardian of Beatrice's memories and a bridge between all involved. "The lawyer called this morning," Henry commented to Helen. "Carter's trial is set for next month." Vincent Torres made a plea bargain, revealing the entire scheme. "And the company?" Helen asked. "We're slowly reorganizing everything. Claire has been incredible. She took over the compliance directorship and is implementing a total transparency policy. Sarah helps us with the legal part, ensuring everything is done within the law." In the covered area of the garden, Rachel was organizing a photo mural. Among the recent images of Michael, she had placed a photo of Beatrice, smiling at one of the charity events. It was important for the boy to grow up knowing his biological mother's face, understanding that his story, although complex, was above all a story of love. "Michael will have a lot to process when he grows up," Claire said, approaching Sarah with the boy in her arms. "But we'll do it together, won't we?" Sarah nodded, taking her son in her arms. "He will have so much love that the complexity of his origin will be just another chapter in his story. A chapter about how different people can unite for the good of a child." Henry joined them, bringing the birthday cake. It was a symbolic moment, their first celebration as an unconventional but deeply united family. "Before we sing Happy Birthday," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "I want to thank everyone here. Helen, for your loyalty and wisdom. Rachel, for your courage in exposing the truth. Sandra, for your tireless dedication in helping us unravel everything." He paused, looking at Claire and Sarah. "And especially you two. Claire, my wife, who showed a strength I never imagined, forgiving my mistakes and helping to build something new. And Sarah, who transformed a tragedy into an opportunity for redemption for all of us." Michael, oblivious to the emotional speeches, was trying to reach the cake with his little hands. Everyone laughed, breaking the solemnity of the moment. I think someone is more interested in the cake than in speeches, Sarah joked. The candles were lit, and everyone gathered to sing. Michael, in Claire's lap but holding Sarah's hand, smiled, with the innocence of his age. In his little face the similarities to Henry were undeniable, but there were also traces of Beatrice, a constant reminder that his existence was a miracle born of unlikely circumstances. After the cake was cut, and the children were playing under Helen's supervision, the adults gathered on the porch. The sun was beginning to set, painting the New York sky with shades of pink and orange. "You know," said Claire, observing the horizon, "I think Beatrice would be proud, not just of Michael, but of how we managed to transform this whole tragedy into something positive." "The truth always finds its way," Sarah replied softly, "even if it takes time, even if the path is winding." Henry embraced both of them, watching his son play in the garden. The boy who was almost separated from his true story was now at the center of a peculiar family, built on the foundations of love, truth, and redemption. The sun finally set, but the garden remained illuminated by the lights of decorative lanterns and, most importantly, by the smiles of the people who were there. Somewhere Beatrice could rest in peace, knowing that her son was protected and loved, surrounded by people who would ensure that her story would never be forgotten. The future would be different from what any of them had imagined, but it would be true. And in the end, that's what mattered. The truth had triumphed, and with it love had found its way. As the party wound down, Sarah found herself alone with Michael for a moment. The boy, tired from all the excitement, nestled in her arms, his eyes heavy with sleep. She gently stroked his hair, marveling at how this child had changed everything in her life. "You know, little one," she whispered, "your story is quite extraordinary, but I promise you, it's a story of love. So much love." Claire approached, smiling at the tender scene. "He's lucky to have you, Sarah. We all are." Sarah looked up, meeting Claire's gaze. The bond between them, once unimaginable, had grown strong through their shared love for Michael. "We're all lucky to have each other," she replied. Henry joined, them wrapping an arm around Claire's waist. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for everything that happened. It brought us here, to this moment." As they stood there, the unlikely family unit united by circumstances beyond their control, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, for Michael's sake and for their own. The next morning, as New York City awakened to a new day, the Matthews household stirred with a sense of renewed purpose. Henry, dressed for work, but with a softness in his demeanor that was new to him, entered Michael's room where Sarah was getting the boy ready for the day. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "about the company, about our future." Sarah looked up, curiosity in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I want to create a foundation," Henry explained, "in Beatrice's name, to help single mothers, to fund research into corporate transparency, to make something good out of all this." Sarah smiled, lifting Michael into her arms. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Beatrice would have loved it." "We'll need legal help setting it up," Henry continued. "I was hoping you might be interested in taking that on." Before Sarah could respond, Claire appeared in the doorway. "Are you poaching my lawyer, darling?" She teased, but her eyes were warm. "Our lawyer," Henry corrected gently. "Our family." The three adults shared a look of understanding. They had come so far from that rainy night when Sarah had made an impossible choice. Now, they were building something unique, something that defied conventional definitions of family. As they made their way downstairs for breakfast, Helen greeted them with a warm smile. The house, once cold and impersonal, now felt like a true home. Photos of Michael adorned the walls alongside a beautiful portrait of Beatrice that Claire had commissioned. "Mr. Matthews," Helen said, "there's a call for you in the study. It's the district attorney's office." Henry nodded, excusing himself. The investigation into Robert Carter's activities was ongoing, each day revealing new depths to the man's corruption. But with every revelation, they felt closer to true justice, not just for themselves, but for Beatrice. In the kitchen, Sarah helped Michael with his breakfast, while Claire prepared coffee. The domesticity of the scene belied the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. "I've been thinking about going back to work," Sarah said suddenly. "Maybe start my own practice focusing on family law and corporate ethics." Claire nodded encouragingly. "I think that's a great idea. You could do a lot of good." "And what about you?" Sarah asked. "Any plans?" Claire's eyes sparkled with determination. "Actually, yes. I want to get more involved in the company's charitable initiatives. Use our resources to make a real difference." As they discussed their plans, Michael babbled happily, reaching for both women in turn. His innocence and joy were a constant reminder of why they had all chosen to forge this unconventional path. Henry returned, his face serious but not troubled. "The DA wants to meet with all of us next week. They're building a solid case against Carter, but they need our testimonies." Sarah and Claire exchanged glances. They knew this day would come, the day when they would have to relive everything in a courtroom to expose their story to the world. "We'll be ready," Sarah said firmly. "For Michael, for Beatrice, for all of us." Henry nodded, his gaze softening, as it fell on his son. "Together we can face anything." As the morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the kitchen and the 4 people in it, there was a sense of hope, of new beginnings. They had weathered a storm that would have torn most families apart, but instead, it had forged them into something stronger, something unique. Michael, oblivious to the weight of his own story, laughed as he smeared oatmeal across his cheek. And in that laughter, in that simple, joyful moment, they all found the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For this wasn't just Michael's story anymore. It was theirs, a story of redemption, of unconventional love, and of the family they had chosen to build together. As the weeks passed, the Matthews household settled into a new rhythm. Sarah, now working on establishing her own law practice, split her time between the office and home. Claire, true to her word, had become deeply involved in the company's charitable initiatives, often bringing Michael along to events where his infectious laughter charmed everyone. Henry, for his part, found himself changed in ways he never expected. The ruthless businessman was still there, but tempered now by a newfound sense of responsibility and compassion. He threw himself into the creation of the Beatrice Oliveira Foundation, determined to honor her memory by helping others. The day of their meeting with the district attorney arrived sooner than they expected. As they sat in the imposing office, surrounded by law books and the weight of justice, each of them felt the gravity of the moment. "We've built a strong case against Robert Carter," the DA explained, his voice grave. "But we need your testimonies to really nail it down. Are you prepared for what that might mean, the publicity, the scrutiny?" Henry reached out, taking both Claire's and Sarah's hands in his. "We're ready," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes to see justice done." As they left the DA's office, a small crowd of reporters had gathered outside. News of the impending trial had begun to leak, and the story of the powerful industrialist, the baby, and the 2 women was too juicy for the media to ignore. "Mr. Matthews, is it true that the child is your biological son?" "Ms. Pearson, how does it feel to raise another woman's baby?" "Mrs. Matthews, do you have any comment on your husband's infidelity?" The questions flew at them like arrows, but they moved through the crowd as one unit, protecting each other. It was Claire who finally turned to address the reporters, her voice steady and clear. "We are a family," she said simply. "Unconventional, perhaps, but bound by love and a commitment to truth. That's all we have to say for now." Back at the mansion, Helen had prepared a comforting meal, sensing they would need it after the stressful day. As they sat around the dining table, Michael secure in his high chair, there was a moment of quiet reflection. "It's going to get worse before it gets better, isn't it?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. Henry nodded solemnly. "The trial will bring everything into the open. Our lives, Beatrice's life, the company's dealings. It'll all be out there for the world to see and judge. But we'll face it together," Claire added, her voice firm, "for Michael, for Beatrice, for ourselves." As if sensing the seriousness of the conversation, Michael chose that moment to fling a spoonful of mashed potatoes across the table, giggling at his own antics. The tension broke as they all burst into laughter, reminded once again of the joy at the center of their unconventional family. Later that night, after Michael had been put to bed, the three adults found themselves in Henry's study. The room, once a symbol of corporate power, had been transformed. Family photos now shared space with business awards, and a beautiful portrait of Beatrice hung prominently on one wall. "I've been thinking," Henry said, swirling a glass of scotch, "about the future, about legacy." Sarah and Claire exchanged glances, sensing the weight in his words. "I want to change the company," he continued. "Not just surface-level CSR initiatives, but real structural change. Transparency, ethical practices, a commitment to social good. I want to build something that Michael can be proud to inherit one day, if he chooses." "That's a big undertaking," Sarah observed. "The board might resist." Henry's eyes flashed with determination. "Let them try. I built this company. I can rebuild it too. Better this time, with a conscience." Claire leaned forward, her face thoughtful. "We could tie it into the foundation's work, show how ethical business practices and social responsibility can go hand in hand with profitability." As they discussed ideas late into the night, there was a sense of purpose, of rightness. They were no longer just reacting to circumstances, but actively shaping their future, and Michael's. The next morning dawned bright and clear. As Sarah prepared to head to her office, she paused in the nursery. Michael was awake, standing in his crib and reaching for her with a happy gurgle. As she lifted him into her arms, Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This child, born of complex circumstances and painful choices, had become the center of a new kind of family, a family built on truth, forgiveness, and unconditional love. "You know, little one," she whispered, echoing words she'd spoken on his birthday. "Your story is extraordinary, but it's a story of love. So much love." Outside, New York City bustled with its usual energy, but inside the Matthews mansion, a quiet revolution was taking place, a revolution of the heart, reshaping lives and redefining what it means to be a family. As Sarah carried Michael downstairs, where Claire and Henry waited to start their day together, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as one. United by choice, bound by love, they were ready to write the next chapter of their extraordinary story. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of tension and determination as the Matthews family prepared for the upcoming trial. The media frenzy around their story had intensified, with reporters camped outside their home and office, hungry for any tidbit of information. Sarah threw herself into preparing their legal strategy, working long hours to ensure every detail was covered. Claire focused on managing the public relations aspect, crafting careful statements, and coordinating with the company's PR team. Henry, for his part, spent his time shoring up support among the board members and key investors, explaining his vision for a more transparent and ethical company. Through it all, Michael remained blissfully unaware, his laughter and innocence a constant reminder of why they were fighting so hard. One evening, as they sat in the living room after putting Michael to bed, Henry broached a subject that had been weighing on his mind. "I've been thinking about Beatrice's parents," he said softly. "They deserve to know their grandson." Sarah and Claire exchanged glances. It was a complication they hadn't considered, but they knew Henry was right. "Do you know how to contact them?" Sarah asked. Henry nodded. "They live in a small town upstate. I've been sending them money anonymously since Beatrice disappeared. It was the least I could do." Claire reached out and squeezed his hand. "We'll reach out to them together. They're part of Michael's story too." The next weekend, they made the drive upstate, Michael securely fastened in his car seat between Sarah and Claire. The Oliveira home was a modest two-story house with a well-tended garden. As they pulled up, an older couple emerged onto the porch, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Henry stepped out first, followed by the others. "Mr. and Mrs. Oliveira?" he said, his voice catching slightly. "I'm Henry Matthews. There's someone I'd like you to meet." As Sarah lifted Michael from the car, the Oliveira's eyes widened in recognition. Mrs. Oliveira's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "He looks just like her," Mr. Oliveira whispered. The next few hours were filled with tears, explanations, and the beginnings of healing. The Oliveiras shared stories of Beatrice's childhood, showing photos that Michael studied with curious eyes. When it was time to leave, promises were made for regular visits and video calls. On the drive back to the city, a weight seemed to have lifted. They had faced one of their biggest fears, confronting the pain of Beatrice's loss, and had come through it stronger. "We did the right thing," Claire said, looking back at Michael, who had fallen asleep. Sarah nodded. "He deserves to know. All parts of his family." Henry, eyes on the road, felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. "We all do," he said softly. As they neared the city, the skyline coming into view, they knew that the real challenges were still ahead. The trial, the media scrutiny, the task of reshaping the company. All of it loomed large. But in that moment, with Michael sleeping peacefully and the warmth of newfound family ties, they felt ready for whatever came next. They were no longer just three individuals brought together by circumstance. They were a family, unconventional perhaps, but bound by love, truth, and a shared commitment to honoring Beatrice's memory through the life of her son. As they pulled into the driveway of the Matthews mansion, Helen was waiting for them, a warm smile on her face. She had been more than just a housekeeper through all of this. She had been a confidant, a support, and in many ways, the heart of their home. "Welcome back," she said, opening the car door. "How did it go?" Sarah smiled, lifting the still sleeping Michael into her arms. "Better than we could have hoped," she replied. Claire nodded in agreement. "It feels like we've closed a circle somehow, or maybe opened a new one." As they walked into the house, Henry paused, looking at the people around him. His wife, who had shown a strength and compassion he never knew she possessed. Sarah, who had gone from a stranger in desperate circumstances to an integral part of their lives. Helen, whose quiet wisdom had guided them through so much. And Michael, the innocent center of their world. "You know," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think Beatrice would be proud of all of us." The others nodded, understanding the weight of his words. They had taken a tragedy and transformed it into something beautiful, a family built on honesty, forgiveness, and unconditional love. As they settled in for the evening, the city lights twinkling beyond the windows, there was a sense of peace in the Matthews home. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. United by choice, bound by love, they were ready to write the next chapter of their extraordinary story. "You know, little one," she whispered, echoing words she'd spoken on his birthday. "Your story is extraordinary, but it's a story of love, so much love." Outside, New York City bustled with its usual energy, but inside the Matthews mansion, a quiet revolution was taking place. A revolution of the heart, reshaping lives and redefining what it means to be a family. As Sarah carried Michael downstairs, where Claire and Henry waited to start their day together, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as one. United by choice, bound by love, they were ready to write the next chapter of their extraordinary story. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of tension and determination as the Matthews family prepared for the upcoming trial. The media frenzy around their story had intensified, with reporters camped outside their home and office, hungry for any tidbit of information. Sarah threw herself into preparing their legal strategy, working long hours to ensure every detail was covered. Claire focused on managing the public relations aspect, crafting careful statements and coordinating with the company's PR team. Henry, for his part, spent his time shoring up support among the board members and key investors, explaining his vision for a more transparent and ethical company. Through it all, Michael remained blissfully unaware, his laughter and innocence a constant reminder of why they were fighting so hard. One evening, as they sat in the living room after putting Michael to bed, Henry broached a subject that had been weighing on his mind. "I've been thinking about Beatrice's parents," he said softly. "They deserve to know their grandson." Sarah and Claire exchanged glances. It was a complication they hadn't considered, but they knew Henry was right. "Do you know how to contact them?" Sarah asked. Henry nodded. "They live in a small town upstate. I've been sending them money anonymously since Beatrice disappeared. It was the least I could do." Claire reached out and squeezed his hand. "We'll reach out to them together. They're part of Michael's story, too." The next weekend, they made the drive upstate. Michael securely fastened in his car seat between Sarah and Claire. The Oliveira home was a modest two-story house with a well-tended garden. As they pulled up, an older couple emerged onto the porch, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Henry stepped out first, followed by the others. "Mr. and Mrs. Oliveira," he said, his voice catching slightly. "I'm Henry Matthews. There's someone I'd like you to meet." As Sarah lifted Michael from the car, the Oliveira's eyes widened in recognition. Mrs. Oliveira's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "He looks just like her," Mr. Oliveira whispered. The next few hours were filled with tears, explanations, and the beginnings of healing. The Oliveiras shared stories of Beatrice's childhood, showing photos that Michael studied with curious eyes. When it was time to leave, promises were made for regular visits and video calls. On the drive back to the city, a weight seemed to have lifted. They had faced one of their biggest fears, confronting the pain of Beatrice's loss, and had come through it stronger. "We did the right thing," Claire said, looking back at Michael, who had fallen asleep. Sarah nodded. "He deserves to know. All parts of his family." Henry, eyes on the road, felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. "We all do," he said softly. As they neared the city, the skyline coming into view, they knew that the real challenges were still ahead. The trial, the media scrutiny, the task of reshaping the company, all of it loomed large. But in that moment, with Michael sleeping peacefully and the warmth of newfound family ties, they felt ready for whatever came next.